He looked at her every single morning. He watched her walk through the corridor with a leather satchel pressed against her arm and her gaze pointed firmly at the floor. He watched her sit beside his daughter at the writing table, guiding a small hand with a feather quill, her voice gentle, her patience endless. He stood near the window of his grand library, arms folded, eyes steady, and still he did not know. 7 years. 7 long years had passed since Duke Arthur Wycliffe of Hartmore had last looked into those eyes. 7 years since the woman he loved was swallowed by scandal, by silence, and, he believed, by grief. He had told himself she was gone. He had built walls around the memory of her. He had filled his mornings with duty and his evenings with distance. And yet she sat in his library every day, teaching his daughter, breathing his air, living under his roof. Lady Elowen Hartley had come home not as his fiancée, not as a noblewoman, not even as herself. She had returned as Miss Ellen Harper, a quiet tutor in a plain cream blouse and a gray wool skirt, her hair pulled severely back, a pair of wire-framed spectacles sitting low on her nose. She had buried herself in plainness, the way a wounded bird tucks itself into dry leaves, hoping to disappear, hoping to survive. But the truth has never once learned how to stay buried. And the question that hung over every room, every glance, every almost moment was this: how long can a man look into the eyes of the woman he once promised his life to and still not see her? I, free. Introduction. The year was 1882. The moors of North Yorkshire stretched grey and endless beyond the iron gates of Hartmore Hall, a grand manor of dark stone and tall windows that caught the morning light like a man too proud to ask for warmth. Wycliffe Hall, as the locals called it, had once been a house of music and laughter. That was before the late Duchess passed, before the whispers began, before little Lady Beatrice stopped smiling at breakfast. Now it was simply a house that ran on discipline and silence. And into this silence stepped Miss Ellen Harper. Her carriage arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the oak trees had already surrendered their leaves and the sky wore the color of cold iron. She stepped down from the carriage door without waiting for the footman, adjusted the spectacles on her nose, and looked up at Hartmore Hall with eyes that knew every stone, every arch, every ivy-covered window frame. She had been here before, not as a tutor, not as Miss Harper, but she pressed that memory down with the same quiet firmness she used for everything else, folded it small, tucked it away, and walked toward the front door as though her heart were perfectly still. It was not. Mrs. Agatha Bexley, the housekeeper of Hartmore Hall, met her at the servants' entrance, a stout woman of 60 with silver-streaked hair pinned beneath a white cap. Mrs. Bexley had the eyes of someone who had seen through 3 generations of house guests and tolerated precisely none of their nonsense. "Miss Harper," she said, studying the new tutor from the hem of her skirt to the top of her plainly dressed hair. "The Duke has dismissed 4 tutors in the past 8 months. Lady Beatrice is a bright child, but she refuses instruction from anyone she does not trust. His Grace expects results, not excuses, and he does not expect conversation." "I understand," Elowen said simply. "Do you?" Mrs. Bexley raised an eyebrow. "Most tutors say that. Most tutors are gone by Christmas." Elowen almost smiled. She said nothing further, and Mrs. Bexley, perhaps unsettled by that quiet confidence, turned and led the way inside. Elowen had not returned to Hartmore Hall for romance. She had not returned to be seen, or recognized, or forgiven. She had come because somewhere inside this manor, hidden in its old rooms, buried beneath years of arranged silence, was the evidence that could restore her father's name. Lord Edmund Hartley, Earl of Ashbourne, had died in disgrace 3 years earlier, still carrying the accusation that had broken him, that he had stolen from the Hartmore Charitable Fund, a fund established to support poor children and widowed mothers across the county. He had not stolen a single penny. Someone else had, and that someone had taken great care to make certain the blame fell upon a quiet, honorable earl who had simply known too much. Elowen knew this. She had known it for years. What she needed was proof, and so she had disguised herself. She had answered a tutor advertisement placed in the Leeds Gazette by the estate of the Duke of Hartmore. She had borrowed the name Harper from an old schoolmistress who had once shown her great kindness, and she had walked back through the gates of the place that had once shaped the happiest years of her life. She had not prepared for one detail. She had not fully prepared to see Arthur again. He was standing in the library doorway when Mrs. Bexley brought her through. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark 3-piece suit of charcoal wool, his dark hair just beginning to show the first threads of silver at the temples. His jaw was set. His gray eyes were unreadable. He held a document in one hand and said nothing for a long moment. Elowen kept her gaze level and her breath even. He looked at her the way a man looks at a stranger, brief, polite, already thinking of something else. "Miss Harper," he said, "my daughter is 8 years old, reads at the level of a child half her age, and has decided she despises arithmetic. You will correct this. Lessons begin at 8 each morning. You will report any concerns to Mrs. Bexley." "Of course, Your Grace," Elowen said. He nodded once. Then he returned to his document and walked away. And Elowen stood in the doorway of a room that had once heard him whisper her name like a prayer and breathed. She was inside. She was unseen. She was safe, for now. Greetings, noble viewers, and welcome to Forbidden Palace. I trust this day finds you well and in excellent spirits. As we journey toward the grand milestone of 1,000 subscribers, your support is humbly requested. If you find delight in tales of mystery, hidden identity, romance, and justice, be sure to subscribe, leave a like upon this video, and join our growing community. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, from which corner of the world do you watch? And what hour does the clock strike in your land at this very moment? Every subscription, every like, and every comment brings us one step closer to our goal. And for that, we are truly grateful. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you are watching from. I will love to say hello to you. Just to know how far our story is going, thank you for your support. Now, without further delay, let us return to our story. Lady Beatrice Wycliffe had, by all reliable accounts, reduced 4 grown adults to tears within the space of 8 months. She had spilled an entire inkwell over a grammar primer, declared French, a language invented purely to humiliate the English, and once locked a tutor out of the schoolroom so she could read adventure novels in peace. She was, in short, a child who was not misbehaving out of cruelty. She was misbehaving because she was lonely, and because no one had thought to ask her which one it was. Elowen walked into the schoolroom on her first morning and found Beatrice already seated at the writing desk, arms folded, chin lifted, brown curls pinned into a reluctant knot, wearing a deep blue dress with white lace at the collar. She had the look of someone prepared for battle. Elowen set her satchel down, removed her gloves, and sat across from the child without saying a word. The silence lasted nearly a full minute. Aren't you going to tell me to sit up straight? Beatrice finally asked. Your posture is already excellent, Elowen said. There is nothing to correct. Beatrice blinked. That was not the opening she had prepared for. Aren't you going to make me start with sums? Not yet. First, I should like to know what you are good at. Another pause. Beatrice appeared to be weighing the danger of honesty. Stories, she said at last. I am good at stories. Then we shall begin there, Elowen said. And she opened her satchel and placed a clean sheet of paper and a feather quill on the desk. Write me the first line of the most interesting story you can imagine, and I will write the second line. We shall take turns. Beatrice stared at the paper. Then she picked up the quill, and from across the room, partially hidden behind the tall bookshelf near the doorway, Duke Arthur Wycliffe watched his daughter write, watched her face lose its careful armor and replace it with something he had nearly forgotten she was capable of, a smile. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away without making a sound. In the schoolroom, Beatrice wrote her opening line with enormous satisfaction. The dragon refused to eat the princess because she was clearly too clever to waste on dinner. Elowen read it, pressed her lips together against a laugh, and wrote the second line. The morning passed like a warm afternoon. 3 days into the new arrangement, Arthur called Miss Harper to his study. The study was a room of books and order. Not a single object out of place. Not a single paper left open. A fire burned low in the grate. The curtains were half drawn. Arthur stood behind his desk in a dark coat, one hand resting on a stack of correspondence, his expression composed in the way of a man who has spent years practicing composure. Elowen entered with her notebook and stood near the window. She kept her eyes slightly lowered, not from submission, from precision. The light from the window fell across her spectacles and turned them opaque. She had arranged this on purpose. Beatrice has stopped throwing books, Arthur said without preamble. She has found a better use for them, Elowen replied. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A small tightening near the eyes, the look of a man who has just heard something he did not expect. She told me last evening that you did not punish her for refusing arithmetic on the second morning, he said. She said you told her that confusion is not the same thing as failure, that the two are often mistaken for each other. That is accurate, Elowen said. Lady Beatrice understands numbers quite well when she is not frightened of being wrong. Shame rarely teaches. It mostly silences. This was true, and it was also the sort of thing that a person learned not from textbooks, but from experience. Arthur looked at her for a moment longer than was necessary. Where did you study? He asked. Privately, she said. My family placed great value on education. Your family. He said it like he was weighing the words. And where are they now? A beat, careful and controlled. Gone, Elowen said simply. There is only me. Arthur said nothing further, but later that evening, standing at the library window watching the last of the daylight leave the moor, he thought about a girl he had loved once, a girl whose father had been taken by scandal and who had, by all accounts, vanished from the world entirely. He thought about her laugh, about the way she used to read aloud with complete unself-consciousness, about the letters that arrived after the disgrace, written in her hand, cold letters, formal letters, letters saying she wanted no contact, no connection, no memory of what they had been. He had believed those letters. He had grieved her for 7 years. He told himself she was gone. He went to bed and tried not to think about the tutor's eyes. The schoolroom became, within a fortnight, the warmest room in Hartmore Hall. Elowen had covered one wall in plain brown paper and let Beatrice fill it with words, not copied texts, not dictated passages, but her own. Words she was learning, words she had made up, words she found in books and wanted to keep. The wall became a kind of map of the child's mind, and it was a very lively map indeed. The arithmetic problem, which had, in truth, been a confidence problem dressed in numbers, was solved by the third week. Elowen had discovered that Beatrice was perfectly capable of calculating large quantities in her head when the question involved horses, or the cost of repairing a saddle, or how many pages per evening she needed to read to finish a novel before Sunday. Motivation, as Elowen had long known, is the very best kind of mathematics teacher. Their lessons ranged far beyond lessons. They talked about the charitable fund at Hartmore Hall had once supported the fund that paid for schooling for poor children in the village and provided winter coal for widowed mothers. Beatrice had heard of it only vaguely. Elowen spoke of it carefully, teaching without leading. "Did you know," Elowen said one morning, as Beatrice practiced her cursive letters, that in 1875 there were more than 40 children in this county who had no schooling at all? Not because they lacked intelligence, but because no one had decided their minds were worth the investment? "That doesn't seem right," Beatrice said, frowning at her letter G. "It isn't right. That is precisely why charitable funds matter and why the people who manage them must be honest, transparent, and accountable. Charity without integrity becomes something else entirely." "What does it become?" Beatrice asked. "A way for the dishonest to feel generous while helping only themselves." Beatrice looked up from her page. Her expression was quite serious for an 8-year-old. "I think my father cares about the fund," she said. "He has all those old ledgers in the locked cabinet. He looks at them sometimes when he thinks no one is watching." Elowen kept her hand steady on the desktop. "He sounds like a careful man," she said. "He is sad," Beatrice said plainly. "He has been sad for a very long time, but he smiles more now. Since you came." Elowen said nothing to that. She picked up her own quill and wrote a line of demonstration script, slowly, deliberately, while her heart did something quiet and complicated beneath her ribs. It was a Thursday afternoon when Arthur heard it. He was passing the schoolroom door, not pausing, not listening, simply passing when the sound came through the gap in the door like something from a different life entirely. Miss Harper was laughing, not a polite laugh, not the careful, controlled sound a servant makes to acknowledge a joke. A real laugh, bright, unguarded, slightly undignified, the laugh of a person who has been caught completely off guard by something genuinely funny. He stopped walking. Through the gap he could see Beatrice holding up her writing page with enormous pride, and on it, in Beatrice's very best cursive, was the sentence, "Arithmetic was invented by a joyless man who had never once seen a horse and thought numbers were more interesting than actual life." Miss Harper had both hands pressed to her mouth. Her spectacles had slipped slightly. Her shoulders were shaking. And the laugh, that laugh, ran straight through Arthur Wycliffe like a blade through still water. He knew that laugh. He stood in the corridor for fully 10 seconds, not moving, not breathing properly, trying to locate the memory that had just reared up from somewhere deep inside him. He had heard that laugh before. The particular rhythm of it, the way it started slowly and then simply gave way, as though the person had fought it briefly and then decided the fight was not worth winning. He had heard it beneath a willow tree on his family's estate, on a summer afternoon 20 years ago. when a girl with dark hair and bright eyes had laughed at something he said, and he had thought, even at 17, that he would like to hear that sound every day of his life. He walked away quickly. That evening, he found an excuse to come to the library early. He chose an old volume of poetry from the shelf, the kind he and Elowen had once read together, and placed it open on the reading table, as though by accident. When Miss Harper came in the next morning to collect a reference book for the schoolroom, he observed, without appearing to observe, whether she noticed the open page. She stopped. She looked at the poem. Her face gave nothing away, but her right hand moved just slightly to her collar, where something small rested on a chain beneath her blouse. She picked up her reference book and left without a word. Arthur stared at the open page for a long time. Sir Edmund Vale arrived at Hartmore Hall on a Wednesday in November, in a lacquered black carriage with gilded fittings, and a coachman who looked as though he had been hired specifically to appear imposing. He was 45 years of age, dark-haired, with silver threaded neatly at the temples, smooth-faced, charming in the particular way of men who have spent years studying which version of themselves makes others feel most comfortable. He had kind eyes in public. In private, his eyes were quite different. Elowen was standing on the upper landing when the carriage arrived. She watched him step down, exchange warm pleasantries with Arthur on the front steps, and laugh at something with the effortless ease of a man without a conscience. She gripped the landing rail. She had last seen Sir Edmund Vale at her father's disgrace hearing. He had sat in the gallery, watching, and when her father's name was read aloud as guilty, he had smoothed his gloves with the calm satisfaction of someone who had just watched a plan reach its conclusion. He was the man who had framed her father. She was certain of it. She had been certain for 7 years. What she did not yet have was proof. He was announced at dinner as an old acquaintance of the Duke's, come to assist in organizing the upcoming Hartmore Charity Gala, the annual event that raised funds for the same charitable foundation her father had been accused of robbing. The cruelty of this arrangement struck Elowen so precisely that she had to excuse herself from the servants' corridor where she had been listening and stand alone in the scullery for 2 full minutes before she trusted herself to walk. Calmly. That evening, Edmund encountered Miss Harper near the library. He looked at her the way a man looks when something does not quite add up. Not suspicion yet, but the early, quiet stirring of it. He noted her posture, her diction, the small, deliberate way she carried herself. "Miss Harper," he said pleasantly, "the new tutor. How delightful. And how long have you been in service?" "Some years," Elowen said, her voice perfectly even. "Remarkable. You carry yourself rather well, he smiled, "for someone in your position." "I was well taught," she said. She excused herself before he could say another word. Back in her room, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and reminded herself, slowly and carefully, of every reason she could not afford to be afraid. It was Beatrice who noticed first. They were sitting together at the schoolroom window one afternoon, Beatrice practicing her letters while Elowen read aloud from a natural history book, when Beatrice looked up mid-sentence and said, with the blunt certainty only children possess, "You wear something on a chain under your dress. I have seen it move when you breathe." Elowen did not look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was reading. Then she set the book down and looked at Beatrice with the same calm honesty she always brought to the child. "Yes," she said, "I do. What is it?" "A ring." "Whose ring?" "A pause that cost something. It was given to me a long time ago by someone I cared for. I keep it as a reminder that some things, even when they are put away, do not stop being real." Beatrice considered this with the gravity of someone who has spent considerable time thinking about things that are real but not visible. "My mother's things are like that," she said quietly. "Father put them away, but they don't stop being hers." "No," Elowen said softly. "They do not." That same evening, Arthur found himself in the library later than usual. The fire had burned down to embers. He was standing at the shelf where the old estate records were kept, searching for an inventory list, when he heard a soft sound from the reading alcove. Miss Harper was there, seated at the small desk near the window, her candle burning low. She did not hear him enter. She was reading, or trying to, but her hand had moved to the chain at her throat, and she held it, very still, the way a person holds something that anchors them. He stepped into the alcove. She startled. The candle flame swayed. "Forgive me," he said. "I did not mean to disturb you." She lowered her hand quickly, straightened, composed herself in a second faster than most people could manage. "No matter, Your Grace. I was just finishing." But he did not leave immediately. He looked at the book open before her and saw, on the page, a passage of old English poetry, the same collection he had placed open in the library days ago, the same verses he had once read aloud on a summer afternoon to a girl who had memorized every line by the end of that same day. "Do you enjoy that collection?" he said quietly. "Very much," she said. "I learned to love it a long time ago. I had a friend once," he said, after a pause that stretched longer than he intended, "who knew every poem in that book from memory. She could recite them backwards and forwards without stumbling on a single word." Elowen kept her eyes on the page. "She sounds remarkable," she said. "She was," he said. "I failed her." The room was very quiet. Elowen stood up, tucked the book carefully under her arm, and wished him good night with a voice that did not shake. She made it to the corridor before she had to stop and press her back against the cold stone wall and simply breathe. It was Beatrice who found them, as it happened, in the way that children find important things entirely by accident and with complete disregard for the gravity of the discovery. She had been rummaging in her late mother's old writing bureau, looking for a particular shade of violet ribbon, when she pulled open the stuck-bottom drawer and found a bundle of letters tied with faded green cord. She brought them to Elowen. "They were in Mama's drawer," she said, holding them out. "They look old. The handwriting is very pretty." Elowen took the bundle and turned it over. The letters were addressed to the late Duchess. The return address on the topmost envelope read, "E. Hartley, Ashbourne House." Elowen's name, Elowen's address, her father's estate. She untied the cord with careful fingers and opened the first letter. She had not written it. It was addressed to the Duchess, and through her, she understood immediately. To Arthur. It described, in language that grew steadily colder with each paragraph, how the writer wished to dissolve all connection with the Duke of Hartmore, how she had no feeling for him remaining, how his abandonment of her family during the charity scandal had demonstrated clearly that his promises meant nothing, how she would be grateful if he never attempted to contact her again. The handwriting was extraordinarily close to hers, but she had not written one word of it. She sat for a long time in the schoolroom, with the letters in her lap, and something enormous settling over her, like the first proper understanding of a wrong that goes much deeper than you knew. She had believed Arthur had chosen reputation over love. She had believed he had received her letters, her real letters, her desperate letters, and decided not to answer. He had never received them. Instead, he had received these. And she had received nothing from him because whoever forged these letters had likely intercepted everything sent from Hartmore as well. Sir Edmund Vale. It had to be. He had moved in both their circles. He had access. He had motive. If Arthur had married Elowen, the Hartley family would have had a powerful protector, and a powerful protector would have made it much harder to frame an honorable earl for a crime he had not committed. Edmund had destroyed 2 families and 1 love story with a pen and a supply of forged ink. That evening, Beatrice, still pleased with her helpful discovery, showed Arthur a smudge of ink on Edmund's writing papers that exactly matched the unusual shade of violet used in one of the old charity fund documents, a shade that was particular to a manufactory in Leeds that had gone out of business in 1876. "I knocked his papers by accident," Beatrice announced at dinner with an expression of entirely unconvincing innocence. The ink fell with great purpose. Arthur looked at the smudge. He looked at his daughter. He looked, briefly, across the table to where Miss Harper sat with her eyes on her plate. Something had changed in his expression. A door opening, very slowly, in a room that had been sealed for years. The fire began near midnight. It started, as fires in old manor houses tend to start, quietly, a smell of smoke that crept under doors before anyone knew to name it. Elowen woke first, as she had trained herself over years of sleeping lightly to the sounds of a world that had not always been kind to her. She was already in the corridor, pulling her robe around her, when she realized the smoke was thickest near the west wing, the old wing where the estate records were stored, where the locked cabinets held 30 years of financial documents, charity accounts, and correspondence, where the proof she had been searching for would either survive the night or not survive it at all. She moved toward the smoke. She should not have. She knew it even as she moved. But 7 years of carrying her father's broken name gave her a very particular kind of stubbornness. She had barely reached the west wing corridor when she found Beatrice. The child had heard the commotion and followed, because Beatrice had inherited from some undetermined ancestor a complete inability to remain in a safe place when something interesting was happening nearby. She was standing in the corridor in her nightgown, holding a candle, looking at the smoke seeping under the west wing door with an expression of genuine fascination. "Beatrice." Elowen kept her voice very even. "Come with me. Now." "But the records." "No. Quickly. Come." She took Beatrice's hand and turned back toward the main staircase and nearly walked into Arthur, who was coming up the stairs at speed with 2 footmen behind him, still in his shirt sleeves, his dark hair undone, looking more like a man than a duke, for possibly the first time since she had returned to Hartmoor. He stopped. He looked at them both. Then he reached past Elowen, scooped Beatrice up in one arm without ceremony, and pressed his other hand firmly against Elowen's shoulder to turn her toward the staircase. "Move," he said quietly. "Both of you. Do not stop." They moved. In the chaos of the next hour, the footmen battling the fire, the maids pouring water from the upper landing, the smell of smoke threading through every room, Arthur stood at the bottom of the staircase in the entrance hall, with Beatrice pressed against his shoulder, and looked across at Miss Harper. She had lost her spectacles somewhere in the rush. She was standing in the lamplight without them, her hair loose from its pins, her eyes bright from the smoke and from something else entirely, and for one full, unguarded moment, she looked exactly like herself. Exactly like Elowen. Arthur went very still. His breath did something strange. "Elowen," he said. Not loudly, barely above a whisper. She blinked, put her hand up to where her spectacles should have been, composed herself in an instant. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was Miss Harper's voice, careful, measured, a half-tone lower than her own. He stared at her for another long moment. "Nothing," he said. "You are unhurt?" "Quite unhurt," she said. "Thank you." He looked away. She looked away. And neither of them slept properly for what remained of the night. In the morning, it was discovered that the fire had begun in a waste-paper basket near the West Wing records room, and that someone had placed dry kindling beneath it. It had not spread far enough to reach the locked cabinets. Most of the documents had survived. Edmund Vale, when questioned, expressed great sorrow and pointed, with smooth regret, to a candle bracket that had not been properly maintained. Arthur thanked him for his concern and said nothing further, but his eyes had changed. The night of the Hartmore Charity Gala arrived cold and clear, the sky above the moors so thick with stars it looked deliberate. The hall had been transformed. Candles blazed in every chandelier. The long dining room was open to the gallery above it, where musicians played. Guests arrived in carriages from across the county lords. Ladies, members of Parliament, charitable donors, church representatives, newspaper correspondents who had been granted access in honor of the occasion. Edmund Vale stood near the fireplace in the great hall and held court as though the evening were his own invention. Elowen had not planned to be at the gala. Tutors did not attend galas. But Beatrice, with the peculiar authority that children sometimes exercise over adults who love them, had told her father that Miss Harper was to come as her companion for the evening, and Arthur, for reasons he was not fully prepared to examine, had agreed. Elowen stood near the gallery stairs in a borrowed evening gown of dark green silk, simple, high-necked, without adornment, with her spectacles in place and her hair pinned into its customary severity. She looked like what she was pretending to be. She and Beatrice had found the ledger 2 hours before the guests arrived. It had been hidden precisely where Arthur's late wife had hidden it, inside the spine of a French grammar book that sat in the schoolroom behind a false cover. A small note in the Duchess's handwriting was tucked inside the cover. "For whoever finds this when the time is right." The ledger was 47 pages long. It documented, in the Duchess's meticulous hand, every irregular transaction from the charity fund between 1873 and 1878, every false entry, every amount diverted, every signature that had been forged, including 5 entries in the name of Lord Edmund Hartley, Earl of Ashbourne, written not by the Earl, but by someone whose pen, pressure, and letter formation matched exactly the forged letters Elowen had found in the bureau. The Duchess had known. She had gathered evidence quietly, privately, without telling anyone, perhaps because she had not yet understood what to do with it. She had hidden it the way a careful woman hides something precious somewhere no one would think to look, in plain sight, inside a child's classroom. Elowen stood at the gala with that ledger locked in the schoolroom and waited. Edmund found her first. He came across the room with a smile that did not travel to his eyes and positioned himself beside her with the comfortable proximity of a man who expects not to be refused. "Miss Harper," he said quietly, beneath the sound of the music, "I have been making inquiries about you, your history. It is most interesting, the gaps one finds." "I am sure it is," Elowen said. "I find myself wondering," he continued pleasantly, "whether the Duke knows exactly who he has employed to teach his daughter." "I imagine he knows enough," she said. "Does he know that Miss Harper does not exist?" Edmund said. "That her teaching certificates were issued to an address that has been unoccupied for 6 years? That her references, while impeccably written, are impossible to verify because the women who supposedly wrote them cannot be found?" The room moved and chattered around them. The music played. No one was listening. "And what do you intend to do with that information?" Elowen asked. "I intend," Edmund said, "to inform the Duke, in front of every guest here this evening, that he has been deceived by an impostor who has been searching his private records without authorization. He adjusted his cufflinks, unless, of course, you choose to leave quietly tonight and never return." Elowen looked at him for a long, steady moment. "No," she said, and she went to find Beatrice. Edmund Vale moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man who has never yet been stopped. He positioned himself near the center of the room where the acoustics were best and waited for a natural pause in conversation. Then he raised his voice, not to a shout, but to the carrying, authoritative register of a man accustomed to being listened to. "I am sorry to interrupt the festivities," he said, "but there is a matter of some urgency regarding the integrity of this household. It has come to my attention that the woman employed as Lady Beatrice's tutor is not who she claims to be. Her references are false, her certificates are forged, and she has been searching the private records of Hartmore Hall for weeks." The room went quiet the way rooms do when something real has just entered them. Arthur turned from where he stood near the gallery stairs. His expression was controlled, but his eyes had sharpened. Elowen stood in the center of the room. She had removed her spectacles. She held them in one hand, and with the other she reached up and unpinned her hair, letting it fall in the dark, unwaved style she had always worn it before she began living under borrowed names. The room watched. She straightened her shoulders and raised her chin, not in defiance, but in the simple, clear posture of a woman who has decided, at last, to take up the space she was always entitled to occupy. "My name," she said, and her voice was her own voice, now clear and measured and carrying across the room without effort, "is Lady Elowen Hartley, daughter of Lord Edmund Hartley, Earl of Ashbourne, former fiancé of the Duke of Hartmore. I came to this house not to steal, but to find the proof that will restore my father's name." The silence deepened. Arthur did not move. His face had gone very still, the stillness of a man standing at the edge of a great shift, when the ground beneath him has changed and the new shape of things is still becoming clear. Edmund's composure slipped for the first time. "This is an absurd." "Lady Beatrice," Elowen said. Beatrice stepped forward from the edge of the room, her chin up, her brown curls perfectly pinned, wearing her best blue dress and the expression of someone who has been waiting for this moment with extraordinary patience. She held out the ledger. "My mother left this," she said, with quiet and complete certainty. "She knew. She kept the record. She hid it in the schoolroom because she believed the truth would be needed someday." She looked directly at Edmund. "Today seems like some day." Arthur took the ledger from his daughter's hands. He opened it and began to read. Around the room, other guests leaned quietly in the direction of people who could see the pages. A member of Parliament near the fireplace asked to look. 2 newspaper correspondents moved forward. A church representative who served on the charitable fund committee reached for his spectacles. Edmund moved toward the door. "Your Grace," Arthur said, without raising his voice, "do not leave." 2 footmen, reading the room with the excellent instincts of men who had served in this house for 20 years, placed themselves near the exits. Edmund stopped. The ledger went through 8 pairs of hands in the following 40 minutes. A magistrate who had come as a donor confirmed, before the room, that the transactions recorded were consistent with the accusations made against Lord Hartley in 1875, and inconsistent with Lord Hartley's known personal finances and documented behavior. The signature pattern identified in the ledger matched documented examples of Edmund Vale's handwriting from charitable committee records still held at the county offices. The truth that had been buried for 7 years came apart in under an hour. When it was over, when the magistrate had spoken privately with Arthur and 2 other witnesses, when Edmund Vale had been asked to remain at Hartmoor until the county sheriff could be sent for, when the room had resolved itself from shock back into something resembling breath, Arthur crossed the floor to where Elowen was standing. She had not moved. She was watching the room with her ledger, now back in her hands, and her spectacles folded in her pocket. And she looked the way she had always looked, beneath the borrowed plainness, like herself. Arthur stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a long moment, at her eyes, at the particular way she held her chin, at the small things he had almost recognized 100 times in the past 2 months and had set aside because he had not trusted what they were telling him. "I looked at you every day," he said quietly. "You did," she agreed. "I looked straight into your eyes. Every morning nearly," she said. He exhaled slowly. A man putting something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. "I received letters," he said, "after the disgrace, in your handwriting, telling me you wanted no contact." "I wrote no such letters," she said. "I wrote to you every week for 3 months. You never answered." "I never received them." She nodded once. She had already known this, had known it, since the schoolroom bureau, since the forged letters, since the pieces had settled into a shape she could finally see whole. But hearing it said aloud, quietly, between them, in the middle of a room full of people who had just witnessed the truth break open, it was different from knowing it alone. "Elowen," he said. The sound of her own name, in his voice, after 7 years, was a complicated thing. "I am not the same woman," she said, "and you will need to be a different man." "I know," he said. "I intend to be." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "We shall see, Your Grace." And she almost smiled. Almost. Sir Edmund Vale lost his title, his seat on the charitable committee, and the accumulated fortune he had built on forged ink and other men's reputations. He was tried before the county magistrate in the spring of 1883 and found guilty of fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of charitable funds. The papers carried the story for 3 weeks. Mrs. Bexley cut out every article and filed them in a leather folder she kept in the kitchen dresser, labeled with her characteristic brevity, "Justice." The Hartmoor Charitable Fund was restored to full operation. The first act of its newly appointed committee was to establish a school for girls in the village, fully funded, fully maintained for children who had no means to pay for their education. The school was named the Hartley School, after the Earl of Ashbourne, whose name had finally, and publicly, been cleared. Mrs. Agatha Bexley remained at Hartmoor Hall for another 12 years and was never once heard to admit she had been wrong about the tutor. She did, however, on one occasion, when pressed, concede that Miss Harper had displayed an unusual quantity of competence for someone of her stated origins. For Mrs. Bexley, this was an apology, and a glowing reference rolled into one. Lady Beatrice Wycliffe grew up surrounded by books, horses, an unreasonable number of opinions about arithmetic, and the absolute certainty that she was loved. She wrote, in her private journal at the age of 12, the following observation: "My mother hid the truth so it would survive. My father looked straight past it until it stood up and introduced itself." And Miss Harper, who was never really Miss Harper, found the courage to say her own name out loud in a room full of people who were supposed to be better than her. I intend to be that kind of brave. Duke Arthur Wycliffe did not receive forgiveness as a gift. He earned it, quietly and without expectation, across the months that followed. He wrote letters, real ones, to her real address, in his own real hand. He answered every one she sent in return. He made no assumptions and no demands. He showed up, repeatedly and patiently, as someone who had learned the difference between loving someone and being worthy of them. It took time. It was supposed to. And Lady Elowen Hartley, who had disguised herself in plain wool and borrowed names and deliberate invisibility for the better part of a decade, who had carried her father's disgrace like a stone and her own grief like a second shadow, stepped into the spring of 1883 as herself. She stood in the sunlight outside the village school on its opening morning, watching a dozen girls in their best clothes walk through the door for the very first time, and she did not look like a woman hiding. She looked like a woman who had decided to stay. No longer a ghost, no longer a scandal, no longer a name borrowed from a kind old schoolmistress. She was Lady Elowen Hartley, and she had come home. Noble viewers, if this tale has stirred your heart, if Lady Elowen's courage moved you, if Arthur's reckoning satisfied you, and if little Beatrice made you smile, then we invite you to stand with Forbidden Palace as our cherished community grows. If you believe truth always finds its way to the light, leave a like upon this video. If you believe love must be earned, not merely claimed, tell us in the comments. And if you wish to hear more stories of hidden identity, long-buried justice, forbidden romance, and triumphant women who refuse to disappear, subscribe and remain with us on this journey. Subscribe to see how this unfolds. Comment where you are watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Every comment, every like, every subscription helps this palace grow stronger. We are grateful, we are honored, and we shall see you in the next story. This story was crafted not only to entertain, but to leave something behind. Here is what Elowen's world teaches us. 1. Shame inherited from others is not yours to carry. Elowen spent years bearing disgrace for a crime her father did not commit. Many of us carry burdens that were placed on us by someone else's dishonesty. You are not responsible for the wrongs done in your name. 2. Education is a form of liberation. The Hartmore Charitable Fund existed to give poor children access to learning. When that fund was stolen, it was not just money that was taken, it was opportunity. Every child who is denied education is denied a future. 3. Charity, without accountability, becomes corruption. Good intentions, poorly governed, can be hijacked by the dishonest. Transparency in charitable giving protects the people the charity is meant to serve. For children's behavior often speaks what their hearts cannot say. Beatrice's resistance to tutors was not defiance, it was loneliness. When we ask why a child is struggling, instead of simply correcting the struggle, we open the door to something more important than compliance: trust. 5. Forgiveness is not a gift, it is earned. Arthur did not receive Elowen's forgiveness because he felt sorry. He earned it because he changed. There is a significant difference between remorse and transformation. 6. A woman's courage is its own form of justice. Elowen did not wait to be rescued. She gathered evidence, endured quietly, and chose her moment. Her strength was not loud, it was sustained. And it was enough. 7. The truth does not expire. It may be buried. It may be hidden beneath false names and locked cabinets and forged letters. But it waits, and it keeps. And when the time is right, it introduces itself.